Hello everyone, I'm Priya Rao with First Weekend Club, and we are sitting down at TIFF 2017 with Mr. Robert Lantos. Welcome, Mr. Lantos.
Thank you for having me.
This is our second attempt because we were trying to go Facebook Live, and of course Facebook Live worked perfectly all day for all our interviews with the talent here at TIFF. And then when we had our one scheduled interview with Mr. Lantos, technical difficulties ensued.
But that goes wherever I go. I bring a I have a technological. Technology is allergic to me.
I see.
And vice versa. We don't like each other. Yeah, no, it breaks down whenever I go and wherever I go.
All right. Well, you're bringing such a force then of nature, I suppose.
It's just a kind of, I am from the Stone Age and we don't get along, you know.
Well, it happens sometimes, but I'm glad that I'm glad that you're taking credit for that.
Yeah, told me.
Thank you. Now, we were just beginning to talk about your having been at all aspects of the Canadian industry, well, any industry, from production to distribution to starting Alliance, and then back full circle to producing your first love of storytelling. And let's maybe switch gears and just talk about the latest project that you're working on with Mr. Don McKellar and fantastic actress that we have here, Tina Keeper.
Through Black Spruce is based on a novel by Joseph Boyden, which won the Giller Prize, and which is set in a contemporary community, the First Nations community, and it's about a woman who disappears and about her sister who goes looking for her. Mm-hmm. Starts in remote Moosonee, which is on James Bay, an extraordinary location where I had never been, and never would have been actually were it not for this film, and eventually works its way to Toronto.
Now, you have worked with so many amazing Canadian directors, Adam McGoyan, Cronenberg, Don McKellar, Jeremy Podeswa. Do you take the projects to them? Do they come to you, or is it a combination of both?
There are no rules, you know. There is just no, not in a pattern. Sometimes it begins with me. I'll read a book and I'll say, it's a great movie in this book, and then I'll start developing it and recruit a director, or sometimes the other way around. The director will bring me. If the director is also a writer, then it's usually the director who will bring me a project that he has written or wants to write. So it really goes both ways. So the last film I did with Adam McGoyan, Remember, was a script that I brought to him. Mm-hmm. But previously, all the other films we did together were projects he brought to me.
Now, you started working with a lot of these directors when they were at the beginning of their careers. And to see where Adam McGoyan is now, to see Jeremy Podeswa where he is now, you have an eye for talent, obviously. Are there directors now up and coming that you have your eye on that you think, I want to work with that person because I see something in them?
You know, yes, but I am at a point in life and career where, you know, I'm getting lazy. So when you work with somebody who hasn't done this before, that's very labor intensive,
right.
And there's a great deal of I don't want to say teaching, but certainly of hand holding is a good word, and I don't like to do that anymore. I don't have the patience. I have much less patience than I used to have. So the answer is yes, I have my eye on fresh talent, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I want to work with first-time directors.
Fair enough.
I'm gonna leave that to the next generation.
And what about films that you have seen, Canadian films that you've seen? Are there films that you thought, I wish I had been involved in that film?
There are films that I have seen that I said, oh my God, I wish I had produced that. I don't know if I could say there's that many Canadian films like that. Maybe, I think Denis Arcand's Les Invasions Barbares and Le Déclin de l'Empire Américain. I mean, those are films that I greatly admire and that, you know, I would have loved to be involved with. But there are other films that, you know, there's two Argentinian films made over the last 5-6 years that I thought were masterpieces, and both times when I saw, you know, The Secret in His Eyes.
I loved that
in
movie.
His Eye, but
yes.
the original Argentinian version,
okay.
not the awful remake. El Secreto en Sus Ojos is the Spanish title.
Okay.
and Relajos Salvajes, which came out as Wild Tales in English. These were two films that I thought, in the last couple of years, that I thought, oh, if I could have only made them. So yeah, from time to time I see a film that I wish I had made. Not necessarily Canadian.
Mm-hmm. But the two that you did mention were Quebec films.
Yeah.
And Quebec has had such a successful run at creating films that Quebecers go to watch at the theaters. What do you think is the barrier in English Canada? Why are we still struggling to find an audience for Canadian films right here in Canada?
I have to reframe your question.
Please do.
In English Canada, it's a struggle to find audiences for any independent film, regardless of its nationality. It's French, Italian, German, Spanish, Japanese. They also have problems finding an audience in English Canada. English Canada is a market that is being colonized by the Hollywood studios for the last 80 years. And is very much follows the pattern of the blockbuster popcorn movies that the studios make. Quebec is different in the same way as European countries are different in that it has a culture of its own. Right. It has a language of its own, and that creates a natural barrier to entry. And so, for example, American television shows don't do particularly well in Quebec. The top-rated TV shows in Quebec, the top 10 are all Quebecois shows. Certainly not the top 10 shows in English Canada are not Canadian. So Quebec has, by virtue of its very indigenous culture and language, it's an island of its own, and consequently has a built-in audience for homegrown production. English Canada is in competition with Hollywood, right. And we don't have any barriers of any kind. So we have to compete with independents from every other country in the world, but we also have to compete really with the Hollywood studios, which make the average budget of a studio movie is considerably greater than the entire budget of all Canadian films combined in a given year.
Absolutely.
One film.
Absolutely.
The average budget of a Hollywood movie these years runs around 130 million US, which is about 160 million of our dollars. And that's about the sum total of all Canadian films plus. Right. So it's it's a whole different universe. They'll spend another 50 to 100 million marketing each movie. That would be unheard of in the Canadian terms. So that's the challenge. But we can't really even expect to compete with the superhero and Hollywood movies. So really what we're looking at is how do we stack up against films from countries that are comparable to ours, say Australia, say Spain, Scandinavia. And if you look at that, we're doing very well. Which doesn't mean that we're doing very well, but we're doing well relative to those who are our size.
Okay. Well, that's definitely a different way of looking at things, because the struggle that we often hear is that Canadians don't want to watch Canadian films, but it has never been phrased to me that that we are actually successful in terms of the size of our film in relation to other films of the equal size. So that's a different framing of the problem, if you were to say.
Look, even independent American films, say the film that won the Academy Award for Best Picture this year, Moonlighting.
Yes.
If it had not won the Academy Award, it would have grossed no more than a typical independent Canadian film. Having won the Oscar for Best Picture, it did twice as much, which is still a very modest number. I mean, Moonlighting, despite its Oscar for Best Picture, with its Canadian box office, was maybe 5% of Wonder Woman,
right.
If that.
Right.
So that gives you a taste of the macroeconomics of the film industry. So. And that's the world in which we live. We don't live in the world of Wonder Woman or X-Men Part 11 or that world.
Now, when you're making your films, such as the film that you talked about with Don McKellar, when you look at distribution now for your films, is Canada just a minor aspect of that? Are you more looking globally to market that film, or is Canada still the big market that you're looking at?
No, Canada has never been a big market.
Shouldn't say big market. Do you main market? So where are the main markets?
No, Canada is not a main market for any film, except Quebec for Quebec films. Right. Yes, I have in my life produced more than 40 films. I've only ever made one in which, by design, Canada was intentionally the main market, and that was Men with Brooms, with Paul Gross. That film was, we had to test a theory, which is, can you actually make like in other countries, a domestic comedy that is going to be embraced by mainstream domestic audiences who normally would not go to see any independent film, Canadian or Norwegian, but who do go to see Hollywood movies in the local multiplex, not necessarily in downtown Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, but in smaller centers. And that was the theory behind Men with Brooms, not the actual storytelling, but the thesis that it could be done. Okay. And in fact, it worked. So there was it was a very large, very commercial success in Canada. Not anywhere else in the world, nor did we expect it to. But that's the only film that I made with that intention. Every other film I've ever made is for the world. And at least it's intended for the world. Sometimes we get there, sometimes we fall short. Mm-hmm. But Canada is a very small market. Canada, in terms of, if you talk to a film professional somewhere in LA or in Europe who's in the business of financing films, they'll look at Canada as a 2, maybe 3% market. Right. That's it, of the global market, about 2%.
Wow. And yet there are so many filmmakers who are trying to launch their career here, and it's so hard to get a film made in Canada, not for Don McKellars and the Adam Egoyans of the world necessarily, but for the next generation that are coming up. Is there any advice, words of wisdom you would have for those people that are starting out in terms of how the industry has changed and trying to just get out there and make a movie?
Now, I'm your guest, so it behooves me to be polite. But it might be, is it impolite if I totally disagree with you?
Absolutely.
Well, I completely disagree with what you just said. Please. It's not difficult to get films made in Canada. It's much easier, they say, in the U.S., or for a first-time filmmaker or a young filmmaker to break through. In America, if you have never made a film before and you want to make a feature film, your parents better have good credit cards, because you're not going to get a dime from anyone. It's different here. There are tremendous support systems in place, starting with the Canada Council, and then Telefilm Canada, and then the OMDC, and the SODEC in Quebec, and Manitoba Film, and the list goes on and on. All kinds of support systems designed to help those who have ambition and skill and talent, but have yet to prove themselves, which don't exist south of the border.
Okay, absolutely. Now, just to play devil's advocate, I'm going to just ask you, in terms of all those granting systems that are there, there's also a lot of competition for those grants, and certainly not enough to go around for all the filmmakers that are trying to get up. Of course, it's a competitive industry and you want to get the cream of the crop. However, I know we have spoken to a lot of young filmmakers who say that it doesn't seem fair that the same filmmakers get funding over and over again. What do you think about that statement?
I don't think everybody should be a filmmaker. I don't think everybody who plays garage hockey should play in the NHL, and they don't. I don't think every kid who plays, who throws a basketball around is going to be in the NBA. So as it is, it's an extremely competitive world in which we have to compete with some, with gargantuan opponents around the world. So you need to prove yourself. But as in terms of barriers to entry, Canada probably has the lowest one, and I am very familiar with how this works in Europe, in the US, in Australia. We probably have the lowest barrier of entry anywhere. So, not everybody was born to be a filmmaker, but if you were born to be a filmmaker, you will bloody well find a way. I did. Nobody ever gave me anything. I made my first film on $25,000 that I cobbled together because I didn't have a dime to my name, and that was how much we made it for. It was a feature film. And then once that worked, the next one was slightly easier.
Right.
That's how it works. That's how it's supposed to work. That's that's the process by which the only filter system by which you can actually separate those who actually have the talent and those who don't. And the truth is that this sounds very elitist, but the truth is most people were not born to be filmmakers. Most people were not born to be elite soccer players either. Lots of people would like to be. I would have liked to be an elite soccer player. I mean, what a great career.
That would be a lot of fun.
Fun, lots of money, lots of girls, prestige, great.
Fans.
But I was never good enough, I just had to live with that. I was never good enough and way too slow.
Well, luckily you found something else that you were very successful at.
At least, I found a way to spend my, to spend my energies and create something that hopefully add some value to some people's lives. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of my first cathartic experience, really, when my first film, In Praise of Older Women, well, actually technically it was my second film, opened in theaters. And the first night, I went from theater to theater where the film was playing, and it was pouring rain in Toronto. And there were lineups outside all the theaters. And it was such an extraordinary feeling. People actually want to share that experience. They want to pay to share and stand in the rain to share that story that I wanted to tell. And I ended up buying coffee for everybody in the lineup because I thought, I was so grateful they were there. But that's the pay. That's the bonus. That's the payoff when you can actually, bring something to other people and that they want.
Right, and it makes them feel something.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we were speaking with Ingrid Veninger earlier, and she basically said exactly what you've said in terms of it. She's teaching filmmaking now, and she says that when her students talk to her about wanting to make a film and how hard it is to get grants, and she said, "Why are you waiting for the grants? Why are you waiting for telefilm? Get out there and make a movie."
Exactly. So my first film was called L'Ange et la Femme, the one that was made for $25,000. At the time, there was no telefilm. There was something called the CFDC, which had an annual budget of $4 million, which when I went to see them with my project, L'Ange et la Femme, they politely, correctly told me, why would we have 10 times more applications than we have money for. You've never made a film. Why would we take you seriously? Even though I had a director, Gilles Carle, who had by then represented Canada in Cannes several times, but who was I? And so I got turned down, as I should have been. And then I sort of had to go out and I had a friend from film school who had a black and white lab in his basement, so that was our lab. Then I got the equipment for free for 10 days because we decided to shoot in January in the middle of Montreal winter when nobody else was shooting, so we could get equipment for free. Right. And then we got together a crew, nobody got paid, everybody got a percentage of the film, all they got was lunch and breakfast, and then we found a location that we got for free, etc., etc. And then I found $25,000 from what was then called Famous Players. They were then the largest exhibitor in Canada, and they had just been bought by Paramount, and they had some obligation to spend a little bit of money in Canadian films. I think it was $200,000 as part of that transaction, and I found out that they had $25,000 that they hadn't yet spent, and it was late in the year. So I went to see the president, who made me wait for several hours in his reception, and then made me come back the next day, and then the day after that, till finally I did see him. And then he said, "How much do you need?" And I said, $25,000. And he said, "And who's directing it?" I said, "Gilles Carle." And he said, "And who's in it?" And Carol Lohr, who at the time was a star in Quebec, is in it. And he said, "And that's all you need?" He never asked me what the budget was. I said, "That's all?" "Yes." He said, "Okay, you have it." And that's how it was financed. But he made me wait for 3 days in his lobby. But so what?
So what?
I
It's
had time
passion and determination.
I had time to kill.
Right.
And so there was no grants from anybody. There were no tax credits either. It's a lot easier today than it was then, from that point of view. What is more difficult today is to navigate the tremendous clutter that's out there because of all the other forms of entertainment competing for eyeballs. That is far more competitive than it was then.
Yes, and that is, I'm sure, it could be an hour-long discussion itself. But if you were to look into a crystal ball based on your experience and what you see happening with the changing face of screens everywhere and content being consumed on so many different platforms, What do you see as the future of feature filmmaking?
I don't know, actually. You know, I could have answered you that question with certainty a couple of years ago.
What would you have said then?
Oh, I would have said that storytelling is forever, and that as long as there are great stories to be told, there will always be an audience for them. I would have said that, but that's still true today. Except maybe feature film will not be the preferred medium for those stories. I don't actually know. It is certainly in the middle of a dramatic shakeup. And changes, and so I think the traditional way of seeing films, which is certainly my favorite way of seeing films, going to a movie theater and seeing it on the large screen
With people
and with an audience and
popcorn
being part of the communal reaction, is under an onslaught of partially the exhibition industries, distribution industries' fault for the kind of films that they make, which are alienating to most people who are over the age of 30, and the actual movie-going experience, which is really designed to keep kids in the multiplex for as long as possible, so they spend the most money on popcorn and nachos and video games, and that's and not to enhance the cinema-going experience. There are a lot of factors, and certainly the quality of television and the delivery systems which make things so easy to consume. These all conspire to create a whole new world, and the outcome, I don't think anybody could quite tell you yet where it's all going to end up.
Well, hopefully storytelling will continue to be king, and I really do hope the theater experience does not disappear completely. It's almost like we see cultures kind of disappearing, and that is part of our culture. As for my generation anyways, I remember seeing movies in the theater with my parents, and for Indian movies there would be an intermission at halftime, and you'd go and get your samosas and your snacks and then come back and watch, and it was such a night out and an event, and that's slowly sort of dissipating now. I hope that there's a resuscitation of that. But
interestingly, Indian movies are among the least affected by all of the upheaval. They still have a vast audience that goes to see them in movie theaters all over the world. And because I think the cultural bonds are, because it's such a distinct culture and the bonds are tight. Same reason why Quebecois go to see films in theaters in Quebec, except on a much larger scale.
Right, that's true, because even here in Toronto, there is a huge community that goes out to see the Indian movies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Bollywood has it right there. And the final question, we were talking about Canada Screens, and you are one of our celebrity curators for Canada Screens, which is one place you can watch Canadian films, because I know it's so hard to catch them when they are in the cinema. They don't last long, and most films don't make it to screen. But you have been one of the curators for us on canadascreens.ca. There are so many great curators there. What are some of your favorite Canadian films over the years, whether or not you were involved in them? And I know you mentioned two Denis Arcand's films, but other than that, what are some of your top films?
But should I give you a modest answer and then leave my own films out of it?
No, you should give me an honest answer.
Well, I'll try and be as modest as I'm able to. Look, Denis Arcand's Jesus of Montreal, Decline of the American Empire, Barbarian Invasions certainly would be on any list. I think Denis Villeneuve's Polytechnique and Maelstrom would be on. So would be his, I think, Jean-Claude Lauzon's Un Jour la Nuit and Leolo would be on any list. I mean, there's a very Quebec-centric list that I'm giving you. On sort of the other side of the Quebec border, it tends to be, my favorite films tend to be made by the filmmakers that I work with, it's Cronenberg's films and Egoyan's films and my own films, which is why I choose to make them. So I love Barney's version. I know I made it, but I love it, and I still see it with audiences some 7 years later, and I see how it moves people all over the world, and it's exactly the reason that I made it. You're gesticulating wildly.
She's, I think, pointing to somebody behind us.
Oh.
But,
and
yes.
or
We're going to run out of batteries. Well, those are amazing films, and Being Julia, of course.
I love Being Julia, and I love Black Robe, which I made, and I mean, if not every film turns out equally well. Probably, maybe my favorite of my own films is a film called Sunshine that it was directed not by a Canadian, by István Szabó, and actually, it's a piece of. It's set in Hungary, so the only thing Canadian about it was Molly Parker, Deborah Unger, and me. But it's a film that sort of resonates a great deal with me because it closely parallels the story of my own people. So. Right.
Well, that's an amazing list of films, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom from over the years, and for your honesty in this interview. It's been a pleasure to sit down with you, Mr. Lantos.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you for having me.